Cryptocurrency regulation has come a long way over the course of the last several years. What was once a wild west is now largely moving toward lawful good, a space that is held to high regulatory standards across the globe. However, while regulations are certainly more abundant than they used to be in crypto, there's still a lot of regulatory evolution that needs to take place in order for innovation to continue to progress. In large countries like the United States, this process is slow and often primarily benefits larger players. However, in smaller jurisdictions, regulators have the means to make regulatory changes more quickly. They can allow greater levels of flexibility to entrepreneurs and innovators, and they can figure out which regulatory structures work and which do not more quickly. Recently, finance magnates spoke with Denis, the Bermudian government's chief fintech advisor, about the future of fintech regulation in Bermuda and beyond. I'm Rachel McIntosh, and this is FMTV. First of all, Denis, thank you once again for coming on the show. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know who you are, but for people who might not know who you are, can you talk about yourself, the work that you do, and how you came to be in this position?
Sure. So I'm Denis Pitcher. I'm the Chief FinTech Advisor to the Premier of Bermuda. I kind of got into this space primarily because I built trading systems for an investment firm for a number of years, started my own tech company, and then kind of became a big advocate of blockchain technologies and crypto on island. And the Premier reached out and asked if I'd get involved and help a little bit. And I've been acting in an advisory capacity for the last couple of years. Still have my tech company at the same time, and kind of just helping where I can to steer Bermuda in the right direction.
Right. So was this like a position that existed before you? Was there like a fintech advisor position, or was the premier just like, hey, this is something that I feel like we could really use?
Sort of. So we had it started in 2017, basically when the premier got invited to this beach event put on by this company called Hub Culture, who is headquartered in Bermuda. And they had a bunch of MIT academics and whatnot here and talking about the future of finance and blockchain and a lot of what was coming. And the premier became very interested, and he created a couple task forces. And there was one on business development, one on legal. And as a result of the task forces, they got invited to go to Davos. And he actually invited a bunch of people, or actually the minister for national security at the time, invited a bunch of people to come to the island because I think he got very excited. He had a couple drinks and said, if you're really curious about the future of fintech, then what you should do is get on a plane and come to Bermuda next week and we'll get started. And they were just like, well, maybe we didn't need to jump in there. And they were like, well, we'll see if anybody is interested in coming to Bermuda in the future. And then they started getting messages on Sunday. Like, okay, finished Friday. They started getting a message. We're coming. We're totally going to come and map this out and work with you.
Oh my God.
I think they just got really excited. They had no idea that this kind of call to action would get taken up. So a bunch of people flew to the island, and they basically blocked out a boardroom for a couple of weeks and mapped out kind of the core of our regulatory framework. And our regulator went away and kind of tweaked it and leveraged a lot of our experience and background in the insurance industry to help craft regulatory clarity around digital assets and treating it as a new asset class, which is a lot of what the industry was asking for at that time. Yeah. And along the way, we had an individual who was kind of driving some of the initiative with our development agency. But he ended up transitioning out, and the premier was looking around. We also had an international consultant, Laura Joseph, was here and working for a number of months, helping to craft some of the original framework. But then she transitioned on, and so the premier was looking for someone local who could take up the call to action from there and help drive things. So that's how I got asked to come on board and help. So I joined in January of 2019. And I've been since.
Okay, awesome. So January of 2019. So that means that this whole, the regulations and this meeting, this call to action that happened in 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, in January 2018, just after Davos, that's when kind of this call to action happened. By about September, we'd rolled out our regulatory framework, which included amendments to our Companies Act to support ICOs, our Digital Asset Business Act that really govern conducting business with digital assets, and kind of clarity around the core risks associated with digital assets and kind of crypto assets or virtual assets, however you like to call it. And then I joined sometime after kind of the bubble had burst and brought more of a traditional finance spin to things, just looking at how that's going to intersect. Since I kind of had the background in traditional finance, but also a keen interest in more of the crypto space as well.
Right. So then when those regulations sort of went on the books, or when that whole thing went live, that was a couple of years ago now, which is basically a lifetime in the cryptocurrency blockchain space. So what kind of growth, did that immediately attract new players into the Bermuda crypto fintech scene, or, is that something that kind of came later on?
It's something that evolved over time. I mean, there was a lot of initial interest. We had a number of companies come to the island before the legislation, expressing a lot of interest in our framework and the clarity we were providing. One of the challenges we've had is that we kind of lacked core banking support, which I think a number of companies have been waiting on. So we struggled to get companies across the line in the very beginning. I mean, our regulator was getting up to speed on how to actually implement the framework, as were companies. But over the last couple of years, we've had about 8 companies get licenses for digital asset businesses. So companies like Bittrex Global and Cross Tower and Stablehouse and XBTO, and a number of others. So we have had kind of steady progress, especially in this year, of just regular licenses granted. And we have kind of a tiered structure to our licensing regime. We're just in the process. I think this week we're finalizing our test license. So it's effectively, you have 3 tiers to our licensing regime. You have the upcoming test license, which is designed for pilot projects or test projects. It allows you to kind of scope out a project without really knowing exactly what your business model and business plan is. So it's a disclosure-based regime. You talk about what you're going to do, you map out what you're going to do, and you test it within a limited scope environment. From there, the premise is that you can then develop your business model and your business plan. And a lot of our regulatory framework is built around the business plan. So what are the risks? What are the risks associated with your business? What are the risks associated with the industry, like custody of assets, compliance, cybersecurity policies, et cetera? How are you defining those around your business plan? And basically, you could then enter the sandbox if you've developed what your business plan is and your risk management policies and procedures. So the sandbox environment is kind of a limited scope environment where you're not dealing with a full scope of customers, but you're able to test out and demonstrate that you can implement your risk management procedures. Then you can graduate to a full license that allows you to operate fully within the scope of what your business plan is and kind of the classes of activities that you're able to do.
Okay, so there's a lot of flexibility there from companies who are in all different stages of development.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest reasons that we found it's a challenge when you take 60 years of expertise in regulating the global insurance industry, like the reinsurance and the captive space. Like Gemini came here and set up a captive insurance company, which is like insurance for insurance companies, or it's self-insurance really, when we're talking a captive. So we've got a lot of history as being a top tier jurisdiction globally for reinsurance. When you take all of that and you apply it to a new technology industry, technologists are trying to move quickly. They're not necessarily knowing how to manage all the risks. So it created a very high barrier to entry. I kind of equate it to having a ladder. Now we scored in the top 6 globally for our CFATF mutual evaluation report. So very high in our global compliance standing. But it's a very difficult set of rungs to climb to achieve. So in order to kind of make it easier for startups and innovators, we wanted to introduce more structure that allows you to actually develop your business model. Because if you have to hire lawyers and auditors and all these risk professionals when you don't even know what your business is yet, then you can't really scale. And it means it costs you millions of dollars to get started. And it was one of these kind of back and forths I had as a tech entrepreneur, saying it just doesn't work. It's not that we want to lower the barriers or we want to lower our standard, but we need to lower the barriers of entry. And then it led to, let's introduce a lower tier, this kind of test framework or this test license that allows you to do pilot projects. And we're trying to attract more players that want to experiment under the supervision of a competent regulator that can then climb through the rungs and then be able to use that as a means to show regulators and legislators in other jurisdictions, here's how we manage the risks with a top tier regulator. Here's what we want to do at larger scale in your jurisdiction. So it's really a kind of a jumping off point for being able to take your products elsewhere.
Very cool. And so you mentioned earlier that one of the early issues with this legislation and regulation was actually that Bermuda didn't necessarily have the banking infrastructure that was needed for some of these players. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're still really struggling with banking support. So we have a local bank that's willing to now open accounts for people that they can pay their local bills in, but we're not really allowing for exchange accounts. So if you're looking to actually exchange between fiat and crypto, you can't do that with local banks. So it's been a significant hurdle in that many in the industry have been looking for that kind of crypto to fiat bridge as a means to grow the business and really have that ability to move into and out of the crypto and fintech space from the traditional finance space. More recently, sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And more recently, I've been working closely with one of the local banks on discussions on how we can start moving things forwards. And one of the areas of discussions that's most promising is around kind of risk-controlled stablecoins. So they're willing to start banking Bermuda dollar or accounts that are tied to people who are individuals who have existing bank accounts on island. So it will allow for kind of a crypto to fiat bridge of sorts for Bermudian entities that have bank accounts, which is at least a good first step. But you end up having to have like a whitelisted stable coin to support that. But we're exploring how that can be used to educate and drive comfort with the space. Because a lot of it's just traditional bankers don't really understand this space. They don't understand the risks. They don't understand the benefits. So it's easier to show them than try and walk through the theory.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So, but I want to touch on something else that you said earlier, which is that that these companies can basically come to Bermuda, when they're still in their early stages, test, and then go to other jurisdictions and then say, hey, see, this works here in Bermuda, can we also come and do it in your jurisdiction as well? So how does that sort of put Bermuda in the stack of global cryptocurrency hubs? Is there incentives for these players to also stay and continue to scale in Bermuda as well as expanding into other jurisdictions? Do you see Bermuda as sort of a regulatory leader? How does that sort of position Bermuda?
Absolutely. Since we launched a framework with regulatory clarity around digital assets, our focus again is very much on the risks, not constraining the ability to innovate in new structures.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges you have is that other jurisdictions can be a lot slower in providing clarity. And one of the big questions you run into is, have you done your due diligence? When people are looking backwards, when you look at some of the big names that are being targeted, for example, in the States, it's looking at their compliance procedures. Have they done customer due diligence like KYC and AML properly? And that's something where if you have gray areas of how you can be regulated and where, you're not necessarily getting that oversight to be able to showcase that, hey, I have done my due diligence and how I've structured my operations, right? So by doing that with Bermuda, you don't necessarily have to worry about the idea that you're trying to fit within traditional securities laws or other kind of constraints. Is it a currency? Is it property? Is it security? Is it what's the legal interpretation? Every country has kind of a different perspective. For those countries that haven't made their views clear, particularly the ones that aren't really up to speed in regulating this space, because it's not their core focus, then having the ability to point to a place that you have taken and done the right thing, you've taken and done as much as you can reasonably, can help protect you from, say, criminal liability. If not necessarily eliminate it, because I mean, if you break local laws, then you're at risk of that country's legal system or court system. But it at least can showcase that you took steps. I mean, you took steps to protect the consumer. You took steps to not facilitate terrorism financing and other kinds of concerns. And then you did it with someone who has a top standing globally, or a jurisdiction and regulator that has a very good standing globally.
Mm-hmm. I see. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and we've kind of mentioned this a couple of times, but I want to talk about CBDCs and, you know, sort of the use of these nationally pegged stable coins. And we were talking before the interview. There's this interview that David Burt, the premier of Bermuda, did with CoinDesk, and the headline of that interview was, quote, "Bermuda will skip the age of CBDC." So can you kind of break that down? What does that even mean?
Sure. Well, it depends on how in depth you define a CBDC. So CBDCs in the kind of classical sense are you're trying to digitize central bank money. So it's where you have monetary policy objectives. You want to be able to change the controls around your kind of local economy, the interest rates, et cetera, direct to consumers. You want to be able to give the consumers the ability to hold the central bank assets directly, or you want to be able to replace traditional cash, or you want to do a wholesale coin that supports movement of money within the banking system. In Bermuda's context, we're actually kind of small. We're 60,000 people, 21 square miles or 40 square kilometers, very kind of tiny island, but we have some of the top infrastructure on the planet because of our insurance industry. So with that, because we're so small, we don't actually have monetary policy or a central bank. Our Bermuda dollar is effectively just a non-digital token. There's $1 US in reserve for every Bermuda dollar that's issued. So we're 100% US dollar reserved. So if we don't have monetary policy and we don't have a central bank, then a central bank digital currency doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right. And a lot of where the central banks are focused is saying, well, how do we control money? How do we control the risks? How do we control privacy? How do we control money? How do we put the rules and structure in place? But it's not necessarily looking at how is the nature of money going to change? How is it going to become programmable? How is it going to become interoperable? How is it going to blend into society the way the internet has? Right. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, then right now there's a big focus globally on let's control money and control the issuance of money. There aren't really, I'm not aware of any other jurisdictions that are like, well, we don't really need to focus on that because we don't really have those problems. So why don't we just look to the next stage and think, well, programmability of money and interoperability of money and kind of the future of global trade and how stable coins can have a big impact, or even CBDCs. I mean, we're likely to just use an American CBDC alongside stable coins or others, depending on how things flush out, as opposed to heavily use our own. And when it really comes down to it, maybe large jurisdictions have the resources, but a small jurisdiction like Bermuda doesn't have the technical skill sets and the resources to be able to even pick the right solutions. So it makes more sense to try and encourage private sector innovators to come here and figure out the optimum solution. Because, I mean, you look at really simple things. Look at the nature of putting, you're going to put all of your citizens' potential transactions on a public or private blockchain, and you're potentially going to link all of their identity information to that. When we look at the states and like Equifax, and you have large corporations dedicated to credit histories and credit scoring that haven't been able to manage people's information, are you really opening yourself up to a lot of risks and saying you're going to link your citizens' financial transactions with their identity information and put that in an accessible system? There's a lot to be figured out. And we don't have the expertise to figure it out. But if we can get enough private sector innovators in, it might be blending like even privacy coins, looking at what are the constraints and risks to give you that sense of you can do small scale transactions, or you can work within a controlled environment with a privacy kind of fiat backed stablecoin. Because realistically, it's not necessarily about hiding things so much as, like, for example, if I want to buy my wife a Christmas gift, it's not something I want to be publicly accessible, because she might find out that I've bought it by having gone to a specific shop and spent there.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to hide anything from I don't care if the government knows what I bought my wife, but I do care if my wife knows.
Right.
So the nature of privacy is important. So how do we bake that in? And I mean, the technology is just so new. In many ways, like for the old school technologists, it's kind of like countries are talking about trying to launch their own bulletin board systems in the early days of the internet, as opposed to looking at it as holistically, how is the internet going to become interconnected? Or for, I guess, the older audience, if it's America Online equivalent, like how are they going to control access to the internet? The decentralized nature means that a lot of things are going to change, and it's hard to predict now how that's going to go. So it's easier to just ride the wave and try and aim for where things are going to be.
Yeah. Wow. That kind of that I've never heard anybody sort of talk about this issue in that particular way. So I'm a little like, whoa.
Well, I can break down examples. I mean, one of the challenges is interoperability.
Yeah.
So I think prior to when we started recording, you mentioned that you're from the States.
Yeah.
I mean, in the States, you have a lot of private healthcare systems. And one of the challenges you have with private healthcare is traceability of payments. And so as an example, I own a pharmacy with my wife. And one of the challenges we have is someone comes in and we have to actually validate their insurance and their coverage and whether or not the medication is covered, and then go through a really complex reconciliation process afterwards to actually claim the money back from the insurance company. Mm-hmm. Programmable money is going to mean that you can take an internal accounting system like an insurance company would have today and be able to actually attach rules and structure around how that money can be spent at the point of sale. Yeah. So someone can walk into that pharmacy and you can validate at the point of sale exactly whether or not they have coverage for the medication they're trying to get. Mm-hmm. Which can remove a lot of that accounting and auditing that happens after the fact. And it's this kind of intersection of private monetary systems, like that's just an internal accounting mechanism of an insurance company, with public monetary systems like CBDCs or stable coins. How are we going to manage these so that you can accept multiple kinds of payments and multiple kinds of rule systems? Not to get too deep into it, but it's like micro monetary systems. Yeah. How are you actually having separate rules built around, well, that pharmacy might be able to accept it and pay that money to a wholesaler, or work within a kind of ecosystem where a lot of the accounting is taken care of. Similar with the government payments in, if the government has a healthcare system where they're assigning value to people, like an account balance, or they're trying to track the insurance payouts that happen to employees or to a national healthcare system, it becomes a question of, as the cost of issuance of money and exchange of money approaches zero, how do we make sure that it's interoperable, that it's exchangeable? And if a country like Bermuda goes and says, we're just going to pick a vendor and we're going to launch a national solution for all payments and all digital, like replacement of cash, well, we basically guarantee we're going to lock ourselves out of the future of innovation in this space, because it's really hard to then get anyone to integrate with that standard that we've tried to set locally, as opposed to trying to figure out what are the global standards. And you see a lot of the global standards development happening on public chains right now through necessity.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess then the question becomes, and maybe this is something that you can speak to a little bit as well, like, who is going to have control over this global standard in the future? You know, is it going to be something like Libra? Is it going to be, or excuse me, DM? Is it going to be, you know, the United States digital dollar? Will it be the digital yuan? You know, like, and I guess, yeah, maybe it's too soon to kind of say, you know, what do you think, Denis? Which one is it going to be?
No, I'd love to answer it.
Okay,
I
go
don't
for
think
it.
it's going to be one. Well, so simple analogy. So which is the global standard for email?
I mean, Gmail comes to mind, but like, I guess that's probably only.
Well, there's many different types,
Yeah.
right? So you've got Gmail, you've got Hotmail, you've got Outlook, you've got Yahoo Mail, you've got Apple Mail, you've got Proton Mail, you've got many different variations.
Okay.
Right. So there may be dominant players, but there's lots of options. And video chat, we're using Zoom right now. Mm-hmm. There's WebEx, there's WeChat, there's WhatsApp, there's many different variations. So is there a dominant player in either of these markets? Not necessarily. You still have kind of an abundance of choice. But what's the big difference between, say, if I send you an email or we try and video chat?
I'm not sure. So
well, think about it this way. In order to send you an email, the only thing I need to know is your address.
Right. Okay.
I don't have to think about whether or not you use Gmail as the underlying system to power your email, or you use Yahoo or use Proton. I don't really care. I have an address and I have a message I want to send to that address, and that's the end of it. And we invented standardization around email 30, 40 years ago that allowed for that. Meanwhile, if we want to chat, video chat wise, well, we have to go into this complicated dance. Well, which chat app are we going to use?
Right.
Which is it going to be? Is it going to be Yahoo? Or sorry, is it going to be WhatsApp? Is it going to be Zoom? Is it going to be WebEx? Is it going to be any number of different ones?
Yeah.
And we have to then have the same app, which makes it quite painful because now I have to have like 10 different chat apps to do my job, which is like, why can't I just have one? Right. Why do I need to deal with this? So when we look at the nature of money, if we're going to have many different digitizations of value, if everything's going to become financialized and tokenized, are we going to have one unifying solution that works for everything? Or are we going to end up needing to drive interoperability? Like, do you want it to be painful like video chat or kind of easy and seamless like email? Mm-hmm. My preference is email. And I think the way we get there is to start having those discussions now and not expect that the digital dollar is going to be the standard or Libra is going to be the standard. I mean, even Facebook is not necessarily as heavily used by the younger generations as the older generation.
No.
A whole different standard of apps, TikTok and others. So are we going to have one unifying standard? No. In reality, it becomes a question of what are people really holding their value in? And it becomes about abundance of choice. It's something like, are we really going to hold dollars? So do we hold dollars only, or are we going to be able to hold any kind of asset that we want, whether it's paintings, it's real estate, equities, governance tokens, dollars? You'll be able to kind of mix and match and hold your own portfolio of whatever means the most to you.
Right. And I'm really interested to see, personally how this programmability aspect sort of shapes out in the future in terms of, maybe different countries trying to get more other individuals to use their currencies or something like that in the future.
It becomes a big technical challenge. I mean, if you're trying to design the one solution that fits them all, it becomes really, really difficult from a technical perspective, as opposed to realizing that different solutions have different rule sets and different strengths. I mean, you look at Twitter and WhatsApp, they're effectively very similar. They both allow you to send the same kind of messages. And yet the rule sets that govern those messages are completely different. They're like governance systems. So effectively, when you look at WhatsApp, you're doing person to person or person to specific group, but it's very opt-in, while Twitter is very much about broadcast. So you subscribe, right? And there's a reason why a lot of people have both apps on their phone. Same with like Telegram and WeChat and others, is that the rules that you place around the conversation differ per application that you're looking for, and you don't necessarily mix those. Well, when you start saying if you're putting rules that are programmable around money in the same way you do around messaging, then you're again going to end up with a variety of different applications that cater to the specific use case.
Right, right. So I guess, perhaps are you seeing that, happening in Bermuda with, this, there's reports that Bermuda is accepting tax payments and other government fees in USD coin, which is stablecoin, and also that, some part of the government of Bermuda, excuse me for not knowing which, has met with Libra currently, formerly Libra, currently DM. So are we already starting to see this kind of future, this interoperable future, different coins for different purposes shape out in Bermuda?
It's a work in progress. I mean, we have a stimulus coin that's been launched on the Liquid network by Stablehouse. It's a locally licensed company. Bittrex Global has suggested that they're interested in launching a stable coin that could potentially be used for some of the crypto to fiat bridge locally. We want to attract other players. We're talking to others that are interested. We talk to everybody. I mean, I've had chats with the guys behind the Digital Dollar Project. I've had chats with people from Libra. I mean, it's not like it's an exclusive thing. It's just you know people in the industry. You talk about what we're doing. You say, hey, you want to come and do it in Bermuda? We're more open to saying, let's create the environment that allows people to experiment, to figure out the right solution, as opposed to we're going to prescribe it, because I couldn't tell you what the winning solution is, as I described. Like, do I know if Libra is going to be the global thing? I don't believe it's going to be. It's going to be use case driven. And every single application that you're looking at has different rule sets, different governance structures. And how do we start catering for that and having that discussion around how do we get an email-like standard? How do we make it so easy for me to send money globally or send value globally that I don't have to think? Because if we have to figure out the same app to use, it's going to be very painful.
Yeah, definitely. So what are you the most excited about now in terms of things that Bermuda is involved in or working on or about to launch?
Well, at the moment, it's just this trying to get local stablecoins launched is the most exciting thing. Just attracting in the discussions I'm having with various players around how we can get that onboarded. You also mentioned the payment of taxes. I mean, some of the challenges that we've run into there, it's easy to just take a payment in, but as soon as you start looking at the underlying structure of government and start saying, well, how are you actually managing like treasury within a government? Well, it becomes a lot more complicated because it's not just about, oh, we want to accept payment and taxes. I mean, that's just pretty basic. But how do you start saying, well, if the future is going to be stablecoin native or digital currency native, how do we actually start looking at and evaluating how that's going to impact internal government systems and how we interact with external parties? And it becomes a question of, okay, well, what are those controls and structures you're putting in place in government? What are the procedures around it? Like I regularly get asked, would the government hodl Bitcoin? And it's a firm no, primarily because we've got $4 billion or so in debt. And that means we don't hodl anything. We basically have money flow in and money flow out. It does not stay.
Yeah.
And that's complex. Like, how are you managing the rules, like the authorization levels of how money flows within government? And then how are you even looking at other aspects like accountability and like the whole space? You're seeing a lot of the tooling come forward where I'd love to see every government employee have their own wallet and be able to have their own kind of internal government accounting money. Doesn't mean that it's actually like specifically linked to a stable coin, but it's an accounting mechanism that you can put the right approvals and controls around, that it can flow more easily so that you don't have all this paperwork that has to be signed. Like every time I had to travel, I had to send all these forms for signatories, as opposed to saying, well, why can't I just send a digital representation of our internal approvals process to the travel agent, pay for a flight with, or claim a flight against that, but then have the second signatory notified that they just need to sign it and have the money go through, and then they can redeem it from our accountant general's department. It's looking at what are the what are the underlying structures to start actually saying, if we're headed towards a digital currency native future, what do we need to actually put in place? What is that future? What does it look like?
Denis, you're a real smart guy.
I just spend a lot of time talking about this space and looking into it. I don't know if it's that much intelligence as much as opportunity and chatting with people like yourself.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has truly been kind of a mind-blowing discussion for me. So I wish you all the best of luck. Any announcements to share, or alternatively, can you tell our listeners where they might be able to find out more information about you and the work that you do?
So we're putting more work into upgrading our fintech.bm website. So we're going to try and do more regular updates. That would probably be one of the best places. You can also follow me on Twitter, which is just at Denis Pitcher or Denis Pitcher if you want to be go with the French pronunciation. And I don't know. I think it's just reach out on the Twitter channel, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. We're trying to put our message out there. And in terms of things that we're working on, it's just looking at what the future is. What do we need to do to pursue kind of the broader vision of a smart contract driven future? The next big thing will be identity, but I don't think we don't have enough time to get into that discussion. But where does that go? How does it impact things? I'm trying to drive some regulatory clarity around that, and that could be a whole separate discussion. But the first step is digitization of value and saying, well, what happens after CBDCs? Or will CBDCs really be the thing? Because I mean, stablecoins are moving pretty quickly, and you're starting to see banks themselves decide they want to launch their own stablecoins more and more. And that the whole question of the Stable Act in the States, what kind of impact that'll have. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to enjoy. Lots of exciting things happening. It's a fun space.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Thank you so much, Denis.
Well, thank you very much as well, Rachel.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.